A few years ago, a dog tag belonging to James Kyoto Izumi was found on Angel Island, eroding from a World War II-era dump associated with the former Fort McDowell. The dog tag is an M1940 second type. In addition to showing James Izumi's name, it also shows the name and address of his next of kin. That was his father, Teruto Izumi of Honolulu, Hawaii. The fact that James' dog tag was found in the Army dump implies it had been discarded. The M1940 second type dog tag was replaced in July of 1943. The new dog tag did not show the soldier's next of kin. James would have been given his new dog tag while being processed through Fort McDowell, part of the San Francisco port of embarkation. James Izumi was a Japanese-American man who was born in Honolulu in 1919. His parents, Teruto and Roko Izumi, had immigrated to the U.S. from Japan prior to his birth. James' father, Teruto, was born in 1893 in Yamaguchi, Japan. In 1907, Teruto traveled alone on the Admiral Haragiberi from Kobe, Japan to Honolulu. At the time, he was 14 years old, and he was described on the passenger list as being a farm worker. According to the ship's log, Teruto's father paid for his son's ticket. When Teruto completed his World War I draft registration cards in 1917, he was still a citizen of Japan, and thus an alien in the eyes of the U.S. government. The card noted that Teruto was self-employed in the laundry business in Honolulu, was the sole provider for his parents, and that he was single. Sometime after 1917, Teruto returned to Japan. In December 1921, he sailed back to Hawaii from Yokohama on the Tenyo Maru. Accompanying him was his wife, Roko, age 25, and their sons, Kyoto, age 2, and Yorito, age 1. Like her husband, Roko was born in Japan and was not a U.S. citizen. Kyoto and Yorito, however, were born in Hawaii, making them first-generation citizens of the U.S., known as Nisei, although the travel papers indicated they were Japanese citizens like their parents. In the federal census of 1930, Teruto and Roko were listed as living in Honolulu, with their 4 children: Kyoto, age 11, Clarence, age 9, Masako, age 7, and Dorothy, age 9 months. There is no mention of Yorito, who, if still alive, would have been 10 years old. According to the 1930 census, Teruto was then a salesman in a clothing store. All 4 of his children were listed as having been born in Hawaii. In 1961, Teruto and Roko became naturalized citizens of the U.S. Following President Roosevelt's approval of Executive Orders 9066 in February 1942 and 9102 the following month, Teruto and Roko would have been considered enemy aliens by the U.S. government. Unlike what happened in California and elsewhere on the West Coast, though, most Japanese nationals in Hawaii were not sent to relocation camps. That's in part due to the large number of Japanese nationals that were living in the Hawaiian Islands at that time, and the impact the relocation would have had on the local economy. Finding no indication to the contrary, I assumed that Teruto and Roko were allowed to remain in their home during the duration of the war. That said, there's a monument at the Rower relocation camp in rural southwestern Arkansas with the name Sergeant James K. Izumi inscribed on it. The monument has the names of the Japanese American men from Rower and those who had family members incarcerated there who served in the U.S. Armed Forces during the war. I don't believe that this is the same man. For one thing, I can find no record that James' parents were sent to Rower, so it's likely that this was a different James K. Izumi. And secondly, James' name would have shown the rank of Tech 4, not Sergeant. That said, I can find no record of there being 2 men with the name of James K. Izumi in the armed forces during the war. For now, the name on the monument is a mystery to me. More than 10,000 people passed through Rower, and as many as 8,475 were interned there at any one time, primarily evacuees from California, including such notables as the great American sculptor Rufusawa and the famed actor George Takei, best known as Mr. Sulu on Star Trek. Sergeant James K. Izumi's name is listed on Block 7 of the Rower Memorial. On November 15, 1941, just 3 weeks before Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, James volunteered for service in the U.S. Army. At the time of his enlistment, he had 2 years of college and some prior experience working in a clothes laundry. Single and without dependents, he was appointed a warrant officer. He was one of approximately 23,000 Nisei who served in the military during World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, I suspect the FBI and military did background checks on their Nisei enlistees. In the months following December 7th, I find no record of James' military service. This will be the first of 2 times that his trail goes cold. However, by June 1942, James had been designated a rifleman in the newly created 100th Infantry Battalion, an outfit comprised primarily of Nisei. It's not clear to me where James was between his enlistment in November 1941 and his assignment to the 100th, 7 months later. Once the 100th had been established, James and the other men of the battalion were sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, for further training. James had gone to school in Japan from the age of 18 to 22 and was likely fluent in Japanese. In November of 1937, he had sailed from Honolulu to Yokohama on the Tatsuta Maru in order to go to school. In December of 1938, he departed Yokohama for his return to Honolulu aboard the Tatsuta Maru. In March of 1939, James again departed Honolulu for Yokohama on the Kamakura Maru. He returned to Honolulu 2 years later, departing Yokohama aboard the Kamakura Maru. On both of his trips to Japan, James was listed on the ship's passenger rosters as being a student studying in Tokyo. James' recent experiences in Japan may have caught the attention of the U.S. authorities following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Perhaps through such scrutiny, U.S. intelligence officials recognized his potential and willingness in aiding the American war effort. While at Camp McCoy, James and several other men from the 100th Battalion were transferred to the Military Language Intelligence School, which had recently been established at Camp Savage, Minnesota. James was a member of the 2nd Camp Savage class, Section 10. The class began in December 1942 and graduated 6 months later. While at Camp Savage, James held the rank of Tech 5. While there, he and the 365 other students in the class studied the military aspects of the Japanese language, as well as various intelligence service techniques. Once graduated, the students would use their newly acquired skills for the purpose of translation, interpretation, and interrogation. Following graduation, James was promoted to Tech 4 and assigned to the Military Intelligence Service somewhere in the Pacific. This is the second time his trail went cold for me. I have yet to find any record of his deployment. Meanwhile, his old outfit, the 100th Infantry Battalion, was sent to North Africa and then on to Europe, where it engaged in especially fierce campaigns against the Axis forces in Italy and France. After intense and bloody fighting at Monte Cassino, the ranks of the badly depleted 100th were reinforced by the legendary 442nd Go for Broke Regimental Combat Team, another unit comprised of Nisei. The 100th and 442nd were merged following the Battle of Monte Cassino. Meanwhile, James was likely engaged in military operations somewhere in the Pacific, or possibly stateside. Given his field training with the 100th Infantry Battalion and his intelligence training at Camp Savage, it's conceivable that he was deployed along the front lines of the Pacific conflict, where he might have served as an interrogator of Japanese prisoners and a translator of captured enemy documents. Of course, he might also have provided these critical services without leaving the continental U.S. Special intelligence units were established in the western U.S., including one at Fort McDowell on San Francisco Bay, where James' dog tag was found. There was another intelligence unit at Byron Hot Springs to the east of San Francisco. This was the top-secret prisoner interrogation center known as Camp Tracy. It was here that highly trained military personnel worked to translate enemy documents and to interrogate Japanese and German POWs before they were shipped to POW camps in the interior of the U.S. In 1944 alone, approximately 920 Japanese prisoners and 645 Germans were interrogated at Camp Tracy, although the maximum number of POWs at the facility at any one time never exceeded about 50. POWs tended to stay at Camp Tracy for around 2 weeks or less before being sent elsewhere. The difficulty in determining where James Izumi was deployed leads me to suspect that he was assigned to a top-secret unit, quite possibly Camp Tracy. The men of this unit were required to swear an oath to never reveal the details of their work. Following the war, James went to work for the Department of Defense as an illustrator at Fort Schaefer, Honolulu. He eventually retired from that position. He died in 2005 at the age of 86 and is buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. At the time of his death, he was survived by his wife, Mary, and their 5 children, 2 of his sisters, 14 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. Mary died in 2017 at the age of 95. She's buried with James. Like Clell Linhart and Walter Savola, the subjects of my most recent podcast, and Emmanuel Jefferson, the topic of my next, James Izumi represents an outstanding example of America's greatest generation. These were the men and women who, through their unflinching service and great sacrifice, provided for the security and well-being of future generations. We should never forget what they did. We should never forget them.